The first thing I noticed when I walked into the lobby that morning was how unfamiliar it suddenly felt, even though I had personally approved every marble tile, every glass panel, and every carefully angled light fixture. The receptionist smiled politely at me the way she smiled at everyone else, not with recognition, not with warmth, but with professional distance. I didn't think much of it at first. I had come in earlier than usual, wearing a simple black coat instead of my tailored suits, and I told myself that maybe I just looked like another consultant passing through. Still, something about that smile lingered with me as I crossed the lobby, a quiet hint that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. I had scheduled that morning to be light on meetings because my mother had asked to stop by the office. She had said it casually, the way she always did, as if my company were still just an extension of our family's living room and not a multinational operation with hundreds of employees and a board of directors. I'd agreed without thinking much about it, partly out of habit and partly because some small part of me still hoped that letting her feel included might soften the way she spoke to me in public. My brother was already there, she'd mentioned, helping review a few things. That phrase had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. As I stepped into the elevator, I saw my reflection in the mirrored walls, my face calm, composed, practiced. Years of running this company had taught me how to look unshaken even when I felt something closer to anticipation than comfort. I pressed the button for the executive floor and watched the doors slide closed, unaware that this would be the last time that day I would move freely through a space that bore my name on legal documents, contracts, and bank accounts, even if it did not yet bear my name on the walls. The elevator opened onto the executive level with its familiar quiet hum. A few assistants stood near the reception desk, their voices low, their movements efficient. I noticed a cluster of unfamiliar faces near the conference room, men and women dressed sharply, their posture stiff with the kind of formality that signals either auditors or trouble. My brother stood among them, smiling too easily, his hand resting on the back of a chair as he spoke animatedly. My mother was beside him, her posture upright, her chin lifted slightly as though she were already addressing an audience. I approached slowly, my heels tapping softly against the polished floor, and caught fragments of conversation as I drew closer. They were talking about leadership, about transitions, about the importance of public perception. Words like stability and continuity floated through the air, detached and official. My mother noticed me first. Her eyes flicked to my face, then away, then back again, as if she were checking her place in a script. There was no flicker of surprise, no warmth, no sign that she saw me as the person who had built everything around her. She cleared her throat and raised her voice just enough to draw attention. "Security," she said, her tone crisp, practiced, unyielding. The word landed in the room like a dropped glass. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. "Escort this woman out," she continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction as though she were pointing out a misplaced object rather than her own daughter. "She doesn't work here." For a heartbeat, no one moved. I stood there, my body still, my expression carefully neutral, even as something cold and sharp slid through my chest. I felt the eyes of the room settle on me, curious, uncertain, already forming judgments. I could see the security guard at the end of the hall hesitate, his hand shifting at his side as he looked between me and my mother. My brother didn't look at me at all. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, the corner of his mouth lifting in something that might have been a smile. I took a slow breath and opened my mouth to speak, but my mother was already moving again, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who believes the space belongs to her by default. "We're in the middle of an important meeting," she added, her voice layered with a practiced politeness that only sharpened the insult. "You'll need to leave." The words were so casual, so dismissive, that for a moment I wondered if this was some kind of misunderstanding, a poorly thought-out attempt at control rather than the calculated display it was becoming. The security guard approached me, his steps measured, his expression apologetic but firm. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to need you to step out." His eyes flicked to my face, searching for confirmation, resistance, explanation. I gave him a small nod, more to steady myself than to comply. The room felt too bright, too quiet, as if every sound had been stripped away except the echo of my mother's voice. As I turned slightly, preparing to walk back toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. I looked composed. Calm. Almost detached. No one in that room could see the way my pulse had spiked, or the way my hands had clenched just enough to leave half-moon marks in my palms. They saw a woman being removed. They did not see the owner of the building. And as I took my first step away, something inside me settled with quiet certainty. They thought they had erased me. They had no idea what my name was about to do to their plans. The elevator ride down felt longer than it ever had before, even though the numbers above the doors ticked by at their usual steady pace. Each descending floor felt like a quiet stripping away of something that had once been assumed to belong to me, not because I had ever doubted my ownership, but because I had underestimated how quickly perception could be weaponized. I stood alone inside the mirrored walls, watching my reflection breathe slowly, steadily, as if my body were determined to maintain calm even while my mind raced ahead to what I knew would come next. There was no panic in me, only a sharpened awareness, the kind that arrives when a situation crosses from uncomfortable into unacceptable. When the doors opened onto the lobby, I stepped out into a space that suddenly felt far more public than it ever had before. Conversations hummed quietly around me, employees passing through with coffee cups and tablets, unaware that a decision had just been made upstairs to redefine my presence within these walls. I could feel the subtle shift in energy as a few people glanced at me, their expressions polite but curious, perhaps having heard something through the invisible channels that carry rumors faster than emails ever could. The receptionist looked up again, her eyes lingering on me for a fraction of a second longer than usual, as if she were trying to place me within a new context she hadn't yet been given. I didn't stop to explain myself to anyone. I walked straight through the revolving doors and into the morning air, letting the city noise ground me. My phone vibrated almost immediately, lighting up with a message from my brother. It was brief, clipped, and layered with condescension, telling me this was for the best and that our mother was only trying to smooth things over with some investors who were concerned about leadership optics. He wrote as though my removal were a minor scheduling adjustment rather than a public erasure. I didn't reply. His words weren't worth my breath, let alone my explanation. Instead, I called my attorney. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert, as though she sensed the urgency before I'd even spoken. I told her exactly what had happened, every word my mother had said, the way security had been instructed to escort me out, the way my brother had stood by without intervention. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that signals a shift from listening to planning. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, sharpened into something precise and strategic. She asked if anyone had attempted to alter my access credentials, if I'd been formally removed from any executive role, if I'd received written notice of any board action. The answer to all of it was no. That, she said quietly, was the mistake they'd made. We met at her office an hour later. I sat across from her polished desk while she pulled up my company's records, scrolling through ownership documents, incorporation filings, and governance structures with quick, efficient movements. My name appeared again and again on the screen, not in small print, not buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, but as the majority shareholder, the founder, the controlling authority. She pointed to it, tapping the screen once for emphasis. "They can't do this," she said flatly. "Not legally. Not procedurally. Not in any way that holds." I felt something in my chest loosen, not because I had doubted my ownership, but because I now saw the path forward with absolute clarity. My mother and brother had moved on assumption and influence, not on authority. They had relied on the comfort of familiar roles and the expectation that I would step aside quietly, the way I always had when it came to family matters. This time, they had miscalculated. My attorney explained that any attempt to remove me would require formal board action, documented votes, and legal notice. None of that had happened. What they'd done was not just disrespectful. It was reckless. We drafted an email together, precise in language and unambiguous in tone. It was addressed to the entire board, the executive leadership team, and the legal department. It outlined exactly what had occurred that morning, cited the relevant sections of our corporate governance, and stated clearly that any attempt to exclude me from my own company was unauthorized and invalid. My attorney added a final paragraph requesting an emergency board meeting within 24 hours to address what she referred to as a breach of governance protocol. The words were clinical. The message behind them was not. By the time I left her office, the calm I'd been holding on to had hardened into resolve. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, unfocused, exhausting. What I felt was something quieter and far more effective: certainty. My phone buzzed repeatedly as replies began to come in, first from board members expressing surprise and concern, then from our general counsel confirming receipt of the message and acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. The story that had been written about me upstairs was already unraveling. That afternoon, I returned to the building, not to re-enter, but to stand across the street and look up at the glass facade that reflected the sky back at itself. I thought about the day I'd signed the lease for that property, the late nights I'd spent negotiating contracts, the risks I'd taken when no one else believed the company would grow beyond a modest startup. Every brick, every pane of glass, every line of code and policy document had been shaped by decisions I'd made. And yet, in a single sentence, my mother had tried to write me out of it all. Inside, I knew the emergency meeting was already being scheduled. Phones would be ringing. Explanations would be demanded. Questions would be asked that could not be brushed aside with family dynamics or vague concerns about optics. My brother would be scrambling, my mother would be recalibrating, and the board would be reviewing documents that told a very different story than the one they'd been presented that morning. They thought they could remove me with a gesture and a sentence. What they didn't realize was that my name wasn't just on the door. It was on every page that mattered. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and the way the invitation arrived told me more than any phone call could have. It was addressed directly to me, formally and respectfully, with my full title listed first. There was no ambiguity in the language, no attempt to soften what had happened, and no space left for interpretation. That single email confirmed what I had already known in theory but was now beginning to see in practice. Whatever version of authority my mother and brother thought they had constructed upstairs had already begun to collapse under the weight of documented reality. Perception can bend truth for a while, but it cannot replace it. I arrived early, not because I felt nervous, but because I wanted to walk into that room on my terms. The lobby felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the invisible narrative surrounding me had. The receptionist greeted me by name this time, her smile warmer, her posture subtly more attentive. Several employees looked up as I passed, offering polite nods that felt less like routine courtesy and more like recognition. It was a small shift, but one that spoke volumes. Stories were already circulating, and this time, my story was being told with facts instead of assumptions. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, I stepped out into a space that now felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. The conference room door was closed, and voices murmured behind it. I paused for a moment, centering myself, then pushed the door open and walked in. Conversation stopped immediately. Heads turned. My mother sat stiffly near the center of the table, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. My brother sat 2 seats away from her, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly to my face before dropping to the documents in front of him. The rest of the board members looked between us, their expressions serious, alert, and unmistakably aware that something significant was about to unfold. I took my seat at the head of the table, the place that had always been mine but which I had so often vacated out of habit or politeness. This time, I stayed. My attorney sat beside me, placing a folder on the table with deliberate calm. The general counsel cleared his throat and began the meeting, outlining the reason for the emergency session in careful, neutral language. He described the reported incident, the instruction given to security, and the absence of any formal board action authorizing such a move. He didn't assign blame. He didn't soften the implications either. His tone made it clear that this wasn't a family disagreement. It was a governance breach. My mother spoke first when the floor was opened, her voice measured but strained. She said she'd only been trying to protect the company, that there had been concerns about stability, that she believed she was acting in everyone's best interest. She avoided using my name, referring to me instead as her, as though speaking directly might acknowledge something she wasn't ready to confront. My brother followed, echoing her sentiments, adding that investors were nervous and that appearances mattered. He framed their actions as preventative rather than punitive, carefully sidestepping the fact that neither of them held the authority to act at all. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize what had happened. I simply stated facts. I explained what had occurred that morning, word for word, including the instruction to security and the claim that I didn't work here. I pointed to the documents my attorney had distributed around the table, copies of incorporation papers, shareholder records, governance policies, all clearly bearing my name. I reminded the board that no motion had been proposed, no vote taken, no notice issued. What had happened, I said, was not a decision. It was an assumption. And assumptions are not authority. The room was silent when I finished. A few board members flipped through the documents again, their brows furrowed. One of them asked my mother directly if she had believed she had the legal right to remove me. She hesitated, then said she'd assumed her position as family gave her a certain level of influence. The word influence echoed uncomfortably around the table. Influence, I realized, had been mistaken for control far too often in this company's early years. That confusion was now being addressed under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. The general counsel spoke again, outlining the potential consequences of what had occurred. Unauthorized interference with executive authority, public misrepresentation of leadership, and improper instruction to security were not just internal issues. They carried legal implications, reputational risk, and potential liability. The words were dry, professional, and devastating. My brother shifted in his seat, his foot tapping under the table. My mother's hands clenched tightly in her lap. One board member finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the meeting began. "Do you feel your position here is being undermined?" she asked me directly. I met her gaze and answered honestly. I said it wasn't about how I felt. It was about what had happened. My position hadn't just been questioned. It had been publicly erased. And erasure, I added quietly, is not a misunderstanding. It's an action. There was no arguing with that. By the time the meeting adjourned, the tone of the room had shifted completely. The board voted to formally reaffirm my authority as majority owner and executive lead, documenting it in writing and issuing internal communication to clarify the company's leadership structure. A separate review was initiated to examine the conduct that had led to the incident. The message was unmistakable. What had happened was not acceptable, and it would not be repeated. As people gathered their papers and stood to leave, my mother remained seated, her gaze fixed on the table. My brother avoided my eyes entirely. I stood, gathering my folder, feeling the strange calm that comes when a situation finally aligns with truth. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. Restored. They had tried to erase me with a sentence. What they hadn't understood was that my authority didn't come from where I stood. It came from what I had built. The days that followed the board meeting unfolded with a quiet intensity that felt more unsettling than open conflict ever could. Internally, the company moved quickly to restore order, issuing formal communications that clarified leadership, authority, and reporting structures in precise, legal language. Emails were sent, policies were reaffirmed, and meetings were held to ensure that no ambiguity remained about who held final decision-making power. From the outside, it probably looked like routine corporate housekeeping. From the inside, it felt like the slow resetting of gravity, the kind that shifts everyone's footing whether they acknowledge it or not. My mother stopped calling altogether. That silence spoke louder than any argument she might have tried to make. It wasn't the silence of acceptance or reflection. It was the silence of recalibration, of someone adjusting to the realization that influence and authority are not interchangeable, and that losing one does not entitle you to claim the other. My brother sent a brief message 2 days later, saying he hadn't meant for things to escalate and that he hoped we could put it behind us. The phrasing irritated me more than any insult would have. He framed the consequences of his actions as an unfortunate side effect rather than a direct result, as though the fallout were something that had simply happened, not something he had helped create. I returned to the office the following week, not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was where I belonged. Walking through the lobby this time felt unmistakably different. The receptionist greeted me by name, standing slightly straighter than before. A few employees paused their conversations to offer brief smiles or nods. None of it was dramatic, but it was meaningful. Recognition had replaced uncertainty, and in a corporate environment, recognition is its own form of stability. I could feel the shift in how people oriented themselves around me, subtle but consistent, as if the company itself were breathing a little easier now that the truth had been put back where it belonged. The security guard who had been instructed to escort me out approached me that morning, his posture careful, his expression apologetic. He told me quietly that he hadn't realized who I was at the time and that he'd only been following orders. I told him I understood, and I meant it. He hadn't been the one who had tried to erase me. He had simply been the instrument. The real lesson, I realized, wasn't about blame. It was about accountability. Orders matter, but so does who gives them. And whether they're authorized to do so. Behind closed doors, the board began its internal review. My mother and brother were asked to provide written statements detailing their actions and reasoning. Lawyers were involved. Policies were scrutinized. The process was formal, methodical, and entirely outside of family dynamics. This wasn't a conversation over dinner or a private disagreement that could be smoothed over with apologies. It was a corporate investigation, and it treated behavior the way companies always do, through documentation, responsibility, and consequence. Watching that unfold was sobering, even for me. I hadn't sought retribution. I had sought correction. What came after was simply the system doing what it was designed to do. My brother's access to certain operational systems was temporarily restricted while the review continued. My mother, who had never held an official executive role but had long operated as though she did, was formally informed that she was no longer permitted to act as a company representative in any capacity. The language of the notice was polite but firm, leaving no room for reinterpretation. It marked a clean boundary between family and governance that had been overdue for years. Reading that document, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief, because clarity had finally arrived. Sadness, because it had required something this public to achieve it. At home, the emotional fallout began to surface. My mother eventually called, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. She said she felt blindsided, that she hadn't realized how far things had gone, that she was just trying to help. I listened, but I didn't step in to reassure her the way I once would have. I told her the truth, that help requires consent, and authority requires legitimacy. She didn't argue with me. She didn't agree either. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she wasn't ready to say. What surprised me most was how calm I felt through all of it. There was no thrill of victory, no satisfaction in watching consequences unfold. There was only a steady sense of alignment, as if my life had finally snapped back into its proper shape. I wasn't fighting for control anymore. I was simply occupying my own space, letting reality do what it naturally does when it's no longer being distorted. It was a quieter kind of strength, but far more sustainable than anger ever could be. As the internal review neared its conclusion, I was asked if I wanted to make a formal statement to be included in the record. I declined. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said in actions, documents, and decisions. The truth doesn't always need a speech. Sometimes it needs a structure that can't be ignored. Standing in my office one evening, looking out over the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows I had once chosen myself, I thought about the moment my mother had gestured toward me and told security to remove me. That sentence had been meant to shrink me, to reassert a hierarchy that no longer existed. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had exposed a fault line that needed to be addressed, and in doing so, it had restored something far more important than control. It had restored truth. They had tried to erase me in front of a room full of people. What they hadn't planned for was that erasing someone who owns the foundation only reveals where the real power lies. The quiet that followed the board's final decision felt heavier than anything that had come before it. The internal review concluded with formal documentation, boundaries set in unambiguous language, and a clear restructuring of how family members could interact with the company, meaning they largely could not. My brother's privileges were permanently reduced, his access limited to what his role actually justified rather than what his last name had previously afforded him. My mother, once a constant presence in my professional world, became a name that appeared only in family contacts, no longer in company emails or meeting calendars. The separation was clean, precise, and absolute. What had once been blurred by tradition was now defined by governance. At home, the atmosphere shifted in quieter but more personal ways. Family gatherings became rare, and when they did occur, they were noticeably restrained. Conversations stayed shallow, avoiding anything that might brush against the truth too closely. My mother watched me with a new expression, one that mixed pride, discomfort, and something like disbelief, as though she were still adjusting to a version of me she hadn't expected to meet. My brother kept his distance, offering polite smiles but never lingering long enough for real conversation. It was clear that something fundamental had changed, and none of us quite knew how to name it yet. What surprised me most wasn't the loss of closeness. It was how little I mourned it. For years, I had confused proximity with connection, access with acceptance. I had mistaken being allowed into conversations for being respected within them. Losing that illusion felt less like loss and more like clarity. I was no longer bending myself to fit a space that had never fully been mine. I was finally standing in a space that was. One afternoon, months later, my mother asked if she could visit my home. Not the office. My home. The distinction mattered. She phrased the request carefully, her voice hesitant, almost formal, as though she were asking for permission rather than assuming it. I agreed, setting a time that felt right for me, not out of obligation but out of intention. When she arrived, she stood at the door for a moment before stepping inside, looking around as if she were entering unfamiliar territory, even though she'd been there many times before. The shift wasn't about the space. It was about the roles. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling between us. She apologized, not fully, not perfectly, but sincerely enough to matter. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd taken for granted, how often she'd spoken for me rather than with me, how easily she'd slipped into authority where she no longer belonged. I listened without interrupting, letting her words settle where they needed to. When she finished, I told her something I hadn't said before, that what hurt most wasn't the attempt to remove me, but the certainty with which she'd believed she could. The certainty that my life was still something she could rearrange. She didn't argue with that. She didn't justify herself. She simply nodded, her eyes lowered, absorbing the truth of it. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no promises that everything would be different from now on. But there was something quieter and perhaps more honest, a recognition that the old map of our relationship no longer worked, and that any future version would have to be drawn differently. As for my brother, our relationship remained distant. We spoke occasionally, always politely, never deeply. There were things he still didn't want to acknowledge, and I no longer felt compelled to help him do so. Some people need to lose access before they learn respect. Some never do. Either way, it was no longer my burden to carry. At work, the company continued to grow, stabilizing under clear leadership and defined boundaries. Employees seemed more at ease, decisions more streamlined, communication more transparent. The absence of informal authority, of unspoken interference, created a clarity that benefited everyone. It was one of those quiet transformations that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would stand by the windows of my office, looking out at the city lights, and think about the moment it all began. The gesture, the sentence, the public erasure that had never truly erased me at all. It had simply revealed where the real lines of power were drawn. It had forced clarity where there had been comfort, and truth where there had been tradition. My mother had once said, "She doesn't work here," as if that were enough to remove me from a place I had built with my own hands. What she hadn't understood then, and what she understood now, was that work isn't what defines ownership. Foundation does. And mine was unmovable. If you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. Stay tuned for our next story.